is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Coffee and chocolate have a lot in common. Both are made from the seeds of fruits grown in warm climates. Both are agricultural crops, often grown by family-owned farms. Both undergo a laborious manual harvest and a usually natural fermentation, and both, usually, with rare exceptions on the cacao side, undergo a roasting process. They enjoy complementary flavors and are even used together in some beverages, desserts, and chocolate bars. And both are massively misunderstood at the consumer end. The products of these crops are luxury items in North America and Europe, but represent the livelihoods of often low-income farmers and laborers in their countries of origin. Predictably, both are rife for economic, labor, and ecological abuses. Today we're going to talk with two gentlemen who work with both coffee and cacao. Kyle Bellinger of Osito Coffee partners with Jose Hadir Lasada in Colombia to import both coffee and cacao to North America and Europe, and through the lens of the Colombian supply chain has a keen understanding of the problems and opportunities facing both coffee and cacao farmers. Hans Westerink runs Violet Sky Chocolate and Cloud Walking Coffee in South Bend, Indiana, and has spent years working with both of these enigmatic beans to deepen his understanding of how to roast and process them to make amazing bean-to-bar chocolate and a perfect cup of coffee. Sitting at the consumer end of the supply chain, he recognizes the problems facing these industries from a public education standpoint. I talked with Kyle and Hans recently about these amazing crops, what they have in common, and what the industries can learn from each other. We start out talking with Kyle about the foundation of Osito and how he got involved with both crops. Then we hear from Hans about running chocolate and coffee businesses side by side, and then finish up with Kyle's reflections on the major problems facing the growers in both industries at origin. First, I asked Kyle about how Osito got started.
Osito was started technically in 2018, although as many of these projects go, the idea for it was probably, the seed was planted many years prior. My background is in coffee. I have been in the industry in the specialty coffee industry for at least 15 years in some capacity. I had experience roasting coffee and worked as a barista, and I am part owner of a small coffee shop here in Connecticut. But when I started buying green coffee for my roasting company, I started traveling to Colombia. And with one of the producers that I met there, I bought a farm, and then very quickly after that, we became exporters of coffee under the brand name Osito. Business was started as an exporting company in Colombia of just specialty coffee, and an importer here in the U.S. of those same coffees. So the idea at the beginning was to just work with high-end Colombian coffee and create very direct connections between producers there and coffee roasters here. Since then, though, we've kind of gone in a lot of different directions that I did not plan for 5 years ago. We have opened offices in Europe as well as Australia. We are in the process of opening an exporting company in Brazil. And with that comes cacao as well. And that started about actually right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was one of those things where my partner Jose and we had some other partners who we'd kind of like gently floated the idea by, like, hey, it'd be kind of cool to work with, fine cacao. And it was a hard no. But that relationship kind of dissolved going into March, April, May of 2020. And at that point, we're like, now we can try this out if you want. And fortunately, where our offices are in central Huila, Colombia, one of the major cacao producing regions is only about a half hour north of our office. And so we would drive through there all the time, see these really old cacao orchards and wonder like why is nobody here? Why aren't people paying attention to this?
Hmm.
When you see other Colombian origins out in the marketplace, Tumaco is a big one, and there's some other places. But like, why is no one paying attention to Huila? Like, it is historically one of the 4 or 5 major regions in Colombia, and so we're just like, well, this seems like an opportunity, not just for us, but these producers as well. And so we shipped our first cacao, I guess, about 2 years ago, and have since, brought on some larger clients that help fund everything, if you will.
What does the name Osito mean?
So in Spanish, it means little bear. It is a deeply personal name. My grandmother grew up on a Native American reservation in central New York, and in that culture, young babies are given traditional names along with American names.
Mhm.
And when I was born, my grandmother and my father gave me the name Owila Ogwai, which that's obviously the Onondaga, but translated into English, it is baby bear. And so Osito is kind of a play on that. It's also a name that sticks in the minds of especially Spanish speaking producers. It's
Sure.
generally an easy name to remember, to say, even, regardless of the language you speak. And so to me, it felt very distinct relative to a lot of like the large associations and cooperatives that are basically they're all kind of acronyms that are relatively uninteresting. So it is both personal, but also like there is a legitimate business reason behind it as well.
So you mentioned that your interest in cacao started from just seeing these cacao orchards that nobody knew about, seemingly. What was the process like for bringing them on board and actually making that part of the business?
Yeah, well, to be clear, my interest in cacao goes way back. Even when I started working in like high-end coffee shops, seeing that a lot of times people would be selling single origin chocolate bars, at the register or on the retail shelves, instantly I was attracted to that because you would see, Dominican Republic or Honduras. You'd see like single countries or single places within a country on a chocolate bar, and like that interests me for the same reasons coffee always interested me. Even at that point though, like I didn't realize what the chocolate was made from, that it came from this fruit in a pod on a tree somewhere
Mhm.
in the tropics. Like didn't really put it all together until a few years later you started learning more about these things. And so my interest in cacao goes back well over 10 years, but as far as like becoming commercially interesting, that was probably more or less when we started this business in 2018. Our approach to buying coffee is to be a very comprehensive buyer, meaning that we buy on favorable terms to the producer. We pay good prices. More often than not, they are fixed prices, meaning they don't fluctuate with the commodity market. And we buy various qualities, which I think is the key element here. And the idea is we want to be as much of a benefit to the producer as possible. And buying cacao is more a play at being a more comprehensive benefit to whole communities. Because there certainly are producers that do have coffee and cacao, and that was the idea that I really wanted to focus on early. But they grow at different elevations, so there's not many producers that have both
Mhm.
products. But at the very least, we could be, buying cacao in, the municipality of Gigante at the same time buying coffee there as well, and being seen as more of a comprehensive benefit to the whole. As far as the onboarding, I did some extensive research about where cacao was being produced, also leaned heavily on my partner Jose, and we kind of came up with a number of names of various associations. And to be clear, when I say an association, I'm referring to a collection of producers who are usually delivering wet cacao to a centralized processing facility where it is centrally fermented and dried and then sold or exported
Mhm.
as a bulked product. Which, to be clear, like that is typically the way you get high quality, but it's also just a logistical thing that makes it easier to sell vast quantities of cacao.
Yeah.
And so we kind of whittled the list down to 2 or 3 associations that were the most interesting. And honestly, we really quickly focused in on an association called Azoka Gigante, which, as I mentioned earlier, is only about a half hour north of our office. It turns out, some of the producers there, they have what are considered to be the oldest orchards in the area, if not Colombia, to be honest. One of the larger farms there is a farm called Finca Casablanca. And talking to the owner, he said it's been in the family since the early 1800s. And there are trees that are still producing from that time.
Wow.
And he even said that when his, I don't know, great grandfather or whatever first arrived there, that there were already trees there, and some of those trees are still producing today. I have a feeling that he has a penchant for being a little bit of a storyteller. But having walked through the farm numerous times, I mean, you can see very, very old trees there, and it is markedly distinct from a lot of the other orchards I've seen elsewhere. There is something different. There's a diversity of cacao genetics there, but there are also just some trees that, like, yes, they are quite obviously much older than any of us.
Sure.
That just became really, really interesting. Basically, it was like, wow, this feels like something special, and nobody's paying attention to it. Basically, there are a number of major producing areas within Colombia, one being Tumaco, as I referenced, in Nariño, down on the coast near Ecuador. There is the Sierra Nevada in northern Colombia, which is, pretty well known. There is Arauca, there is Meta. So there's all these places that are known for producing good cacao. There are companies who are buying there regularly, and there are chocolate makers all over the world who are buying these wonderful cacaos. But Huila specifically, at one point, was kind of the capital of cacao in Colombia. In fact, Fede Cacao, which is the federation that manages all cacao exports, in theory provides support to producers all over the country, was actually founded in Gigante Huila, so just a half hour north of our offices. This is going back to, I think, 1963, 1964. So, I mean, there is a long history of cacao production in this area. And going back to, I want to say 2013, 2014, maybe. So the Magdalena River, which is the longest river in Colombia, flows from not too far from our offices up to Barranquilla, which terminates in the Caribbean. It goes right through the municipality of Gigante. In 2013, 2014 or so, there was a hydroelectric plant that was put on the river and dammed the river. And as a result, there was something like, 600 hectares of cacao producing land that was just flooded and gone. And that basically was a huge blow to the industry in the area. It made it so that big buyers, and there are basically two very, very large buyers in Colombia, they just looked elsewhere because there was no longer that volume that they needed. And so with that, at this, I guess more or less at the same time, craft chocolate is becoming a thing, and people are looking for more interesting origins, and it just was not a place on anybody's radar, despite the fact that there are some very, very interesting flavor profiles, and there's a long history of production there. Not to mention just some very, very old orchards, which, for me, maybe I fetishize that a little bit, but there are some really old, what I think are probably very unique genetics that you just don't see anywhere else in Colombia. And given the fact that southern Colombia, northern Brazil, northern Peru, western Venezuela are basically considered the home of Theobroma cacao, it's not inconceivable that there are just a huge variety. There's a huge variety of genetics that are kind of untapped. Yeah. I'm not an expert. I am not a geneticist, and I know there are people who know a lot more than I do. But that's where my head went when I first saw this place.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are you just importing from Colombia?
At the moment, yes, although we have some things in the works elsewhere. I am currently talking with some producers in Tabasco, Mexico. Some people that I actually met at Northwest Chocolate Festival last November. Some friends of some friends, and we kind of struck up a conversation and are considering moving some of their cacao into the States. The cool thing about Mexico is that it is possible to consolidate coffee and cacao in the same shipping container, which is not possible in Colombia. And so it's possible to kind of start with some smaller shipments and kind of test the market before shipping container loads. So that's cool. We are also, as I mentioned, we are starting a company in Brazil. And with that, we are talking to some cacao producers in Bahia, and I guess further north in Brazil, where a lot of great cacao comes from. And so we're working with a small group of producers there, as well as a local chocolate maker and one of our larger clients, as a kind of a group effort to see if we can move some cacao for our larger client, but also bring some into the United States, at least, to sell to small craft chocolate makers.
So are you serving mostly as a broker for cacao just in the US? You don't have any direct maker relationships?
We are not making chocolate. There is a, kind of a preliminary plan in place to make chocolate in Colombia, where we have, operations that are more set up to do that. Here in the States, we are a very decentralized company. I'm literally here in my basement office, and I work here by myself. Our other employees, most of them are in Pennsylvania, but even then they're kind of spread out, and so we don't really have like an office per se. Thus, no sort of factory or anything. It is a cool idea to think about making chocolate, but at the same time, I also think about roasting coffee, and I'm like, well, I don't really want to compete with our clients. You know what I mean? And so our hope is to really support cacao producers first, and to be able to find the chocolate makers here in North America that can really support them in meaningful ways, and just be a go-between, an exporter, an importer, which are necessary things, but also a financier to help people, pay good prices to producers, but also be able to finance products for chocolate makers who, are typically not the largest of companies with the largest of lines of credit. So
yeah, for sure. You mentioned that you are purchasing cacao of all qualities from these farms. How does that actually work when you're working with some of those cacaos that maybe aren't of the finest grade?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Molope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, especially in the last year or so, because similar to coffee, I mean, there are commodity market prices that impact, local prices that producers are paid. And, when we started the business, at least with coffee, the hope was to pay a fixed price that was so far above the market price that it would just never, there would never be a concern as to whether or not that price would be breached. Well, fast forward a few years, and there we were in, I guess, August 2021, and there was a frost in Brazil. The market spiked and went right through the minimum prices that we were offering. And since then, we've kind of been on like the back foot a little bit, like, okay, well, we gotta reset our prices so we're ahead of the market. But then like a couple weeks later, once again, the market spikes again, and like we are just continually playing catch up with that. Still being ahead of the market, but being above the market, but sometimes there's a little bit of a time lag. And honestly, we experienced a very similar thing with cacao. If you look at the market prices over the last year, they have gone up substantially. And even though going back to even last year, we were paying about 30% above the market for fine cacao. And it was a price that was agreed upon between us and the producers. We asked, like, what do you really need in order to produce high quality cacao? And this is what they said. Fast forward to today, and the current market price is 30% higher than what we were paying last year. And so it's tricky. And so it's from there, it's then convincing our chocolate maker clients, like, okay, it's going to be a lot more expensive this year. We are willing to take less of a margin to facilitate this because we believe in it, but you also have to be flexible as well. I am not familiar enough with the fine cacao industry to understand how the market impacts prices everywhere. But at least in Colombia, it is a day-to-day thing. Every day it changes. Every day it shifts. And the hope is that we can stay on top. We can stay, ahead of the market. We can stay above the market for as long as possible. And I didn't think we'd be in this position now, but here we are, having to really, effectively put our money where our mouth is.
Sure. Before we hear the conclusion of my conversation with Kyle, I want to jump to the consumer end of the coffee and cacao supply chains to hear from someone who works with both to offer roasted coffee, espresso drinks, and bean-to-bar chocolate bars. Hans Westerink runs Violet Sky Chocolate and Cloud Walking Coffee in northern Indiana. Unlike Kyle, Hans started out with chocolate before progressing to coffee. I asked him why he brought coffee on board and enjoyed the honesty of the opening of his response here.
I had a beautiful roaster, and it's like, I should learn to roast coffee on this too. And I fell in love with it. It was never something I wanted to do, but the more I do it, the more I really love. Like, it's similar to the cacao, just in that you get this raw product and you do something, these very simple but powerful transformations.
Cacao came first for you, obviously. What was it like working with a similar ingredient, but one that still has its own needs and proclivities?
Yeah, I mean, roasting coffee was pretty frustrating for like a year, just because it's definitely more finicky. It has a narrower window in terms of roasting than cacao does. And I had been doing cacao for so long, it was like very comfortable with that. And then so stepping into this whole other realm where I was, not used to it at all, and having very high expectations of myself, but it really took a year and a half before I felt comfortable doing it. So that was pretty stressful to like have to do it every week and feel like what I was putting out wasn't what I wanted, basically.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially when you've kind of got your process down for the other thing and you feel like you're on top of that, and then suddenly you're starting over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that sourcing. I know last time we spoke, you were getting your cacao through Uncommon Cacao. Is that still your source for that?
That's the main one, yeah. But I'm getting Venezuelan cacao now from 2020 Chocolate, I think.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've had some of their bars.
Yeah, so they make chocolate and then they're also importing cacao. That's really good stuff. So we got 3 different Venezuelan beans from them. And I like doing that, getting several different cacaos or coffees from one region for me to learn about it and to show people like a range within that country, and just that like Colombia isn't just Colombia, Guatemala isn't just one thing. Like, they have so much variety in every country, and even within a region they can grow vastly different crops. So sort of for me to learn and to teach my customers about what makes them different. It's not just the country, it's the varietals and the processing and the way it's handled the whole time is part of the terroir of both coffee and chocolate. That's been fun for me to like just switch it up and get completely different flavor profiles. And with the chocolate, getting a new bean and trying it as a pure dark chocolate and trying it as a milk chocolate, like at different expressions.
How does that sourcing work then for coffee? Or did you have any existing relationships in place?
I had one guy that I knew from before, just someone I had ran into a bunch and that my friends had bought coffee from. They're called the Coffee Quest. It's very intentional sourcing and like he finds really, really good stuff. Like I just trust. I look just like Uncommon Cacao, I trust that anything he has will be good.
Well, with your interest you just talked about in the different origins for cacao, and especially exploring origins within a close geographical area, how has that worked on the coffee side? Have you enjoyed the same type of exploration with that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I've been doing a lot of Colombian coffee, and there's so much from Colombia, so many micro lots. So they're single farm lots, and they're different varietals. Like we have a pink Bourbon coffee right now, which is just really beautiful and like delicate and floral. And so I've had up to like four coffees from Colombia, which is a well-known country, but people don't usually try like natural processes from there. So someone that I like called Coffee Net is all Colombian coffee, and it's all almost entirely like micro lots of different farmers and different processes, which and a lot of modern processing. So they do like ferments with mandarin added or like passion fruit, or they do carbonic maceration ferments, which are like in a wine vat, like macerated and sealed away from oxygen, which traditionally coffee is fermented like basically in the open air, or maybe covered, but it has oxygen. So that's exciting to try things that I've heard about or read about, and like I can get that from them and play around with it. But definitely they're pricey. So
Those sound interesting though.
but yeah, there's really just too much. Like there's so many things I wish like people reach out to me all the time and have beautiful products, and I'm like, I just can't get it all. So
Yeah.
it's a good problem.
Have you found similar problems or roadblocks on the coffee side as on the cacao side when it comes to traceability and ethics?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of why I go with the people I know, is because there's the trust there. So like transparency is important, but you still need to trust them and trust that what they're telling you is accurate. And the more story I can get, the better. With cacao and coffee, that definitely the social and environmental issues are very much the same.
Well, since both of these can be grown in roughly the same geographical regions, albeit often at different elevations, are you familiar with any opportunities you could have to source from maybe the same grower growing both coffee and cacao?
That's pretty tricky. It does happen, but they just have to have coffee and cacao grow at different elevations. So they're in the same growing regions, but cacao likes a lower elevation, like in the valleys more, and coffee grows best at a high elevation. So they'll be often maybe on the same slope, but in vastly different plots of land just based on elevation. They also have very different harvest times. So you would have to kind of have your harvesting procedures set up for both. I think that's happening more, and like the overlap is growing as time goes on. Um, Cacao, like the industry of like smaller growers and more direct trade is pretty new. So it's definitely like catching up to coffee, I would say, but not nearly there yet, but it's on its way, in terms of like the organization and the structure of it and the information that's available. It's all sort of trying to model itself after coffee.
Well, being on the buying end of the supply chain for both, like you are there things you've noticed that the cacao and coffee worlds could learn from each other?
Yeah, I think so. Coffee, there's a lot of quality control that isn't really formalized with cacao. So just like there's no quality score for cacao, like you can have a defect rating, but for coffee, it's like this rates as a 85, like kind of like with wine or whatever. Like there's those experts that are certified to give it a grade. And that's a big deal because it sets the prices for the export to some extent. Like it says how much you can charge for something based on how the Q grader rates it. And there's no official thing like that for cacao. So it's more just based purely on samples and looking at it and just you really have to try it. But I do think sometimes there's an overemphasis on those numbers too. there's a thing in coffee where like natural processed coffees will always get rated lower because they have more defects or whatever. And those are my favorite, but it's never going to get ranked as high just because that's the way it works. So I don't know. I think it's good to just take it, but not obsess over those numbers. And maybe the cacao industry is a little bit more creative because it's not so set in stone. It's more like people can do whatever they want and think outside the box more easily because it's so young and there's no one that is a certified expert or anything.
Do you feel like that grading makes it easier for you to buy coffee?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
I mean, it's like it will make me pick a coffee over another one. I just wonder about it. I think it's helpful, and it's like a reassurance that you're getting something that's clean, basically. But I still think it's kind of strange.
Well, since you're working at the consumer end of this, so you're actually getting to pass along a final product to consumers, what do you feel like is the difference right now in consumer understanding of chocolate versus coffee?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think they're both pretty misunderstood, at least for my, like, a lot of education's needed, both on like what you're actually buying, but people want to do things socially responsibly. So yeah, in either case, I've had people say like, why isn't it fair trade? And I think, so there's things like that they want those certifications, but they don't quite know what they mean, or like what it makes them feel good, but we need to like give people the information they need to know to understand it. I think that's where it's important with our chocolate making to show people, like we have the machines on display and we show people what cocoa beans look like, and it's sort of like the cue in to like think about where this came from, and also just putting the place names on everything and the farmer names on things. It's like someone grew this, and just they have to do the work themselves, but we can give them clues that there's more to all of this. Yeah, and also it's tricky because you have to convince people to pay 5 times as much or whatever, especially for the chocolate. And that's where I think we need to talk more about the social issues and the environmental issues of it, like especially in the Ivory Coast with cacao. It's pretty bad, like child slavery and the cacao subsidies and things that, I mean, they're just not on the news. It's not something you see on social media, but it's the reason that like mass-produced chocolate's so cheap. And to do it responsibly, it's just going to take a while to get people on board with it, unless they're already looking for that. I guess coffee is easier because just Starbucks has softened them up a little bit with the prices.
Well, I also think, I mean, coffee as it is served is fewer steps removed from the original ingredient than chocolate is. I feel like it's somewhat similar to beer and wine, where people know wine is an agricultural product because they know the one ingredient that is going into it and just getting directly fermented, where beer has multiple ingredients and processes that have to go in. And I feel like with chocolate, people can't look at a chocolate bar and immediately recognize, oh, this was an agricultural product, because there were multiple steps in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And I guess, so that's the thing for me with chocolate, is bringing it back from the state of being candy, most people's minds, they're the same. And coffee has no issues with that. It also helps that people are addicted to coffee.
Yeah.
I guess kind of both of them. We
Yeah.
joke that we're pushers, but
Well, I recently had one of your bars that uses your coffee as well. Talk a little bit about being able to bring those together.
yeah, that's fun. So since we have the melangers, which are like the stone grinders that refine the chocolate, we can add other ingredients into those. And so we basically just add a bunch of cocoa butter to make it liquid enough, and then add a bunch of coffee ground up. And then it takes some extra time, but it will grind it to the point that there's no texture anymore. And it's just as smooth as regular chocolate, but it has up to like 15% coffee beans in it. So yeah, and we do that with other stuff. We just made a black malted chocolate again, which we had made a while ago. It's fun to have almost unlimited possibilities as a chocolate maker. We did like a latte bar and mocha, which has cocoa beans and coffee. Whatever drink we have, we can make it into a chocolate bar. That's a fun concept.
Well, I noticed with the bar I had, it was pretty intense. And I know with a lot of your single origin chocolates, you've usually left a little bit of the wildness in those origins. They're often quite acidic, and your house roast profile, I feel like, leaves a little bit more of that there. Is that mirrored in what you're doing with your coffee? Or I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want brightness in a lot of the coffees, and as much like anytime we can accentuate floral flavors, I really love that. I think for the coffee, it just depends on the intended use too. So like the natural process coffees, I roast as light as I can without them having like off flavors. But that's off flavors is open to interpretation, like depending on like the Nordic roast coffee that is defective according to people who like darker coffee. They think that's too light, it's under roasted. So I don't know, I shoot somewhere in between. I think our chocolate's a little bit more on the light side, and the coffee is a little bit more on the medium. And part of that's just I just want to give people what they want. And the really wild coffees, I try to have like one really wild coffee and then one or two, and then try to have several that are more approachable and just really sweet, really balanced. People love the espresso, so like roasting for espresso is very important. I don't do a dark roast for that, but it is darker than the rest of my coffee. Basically, it has to be. If you don't roast it dark enough, then the espresso machine has more trouble, which is like makes a mess, and it's a pain for my employees. Like for the baristas, they have to struggle with the grinder. And
What is that physical change that the roast does that leads to that?
so like as you roast the bean, it expands. So really light roasts haven't expanded as much. So even the same bean, if I roast it darker, it's noticeably bigger in the bag. Like it fills up the bag more, but just the expansion makes it less dense, and it makes it grind more evenly. And so it makes the steam being pushed through the coffee move through more evenly when it doesn't have as many denser particles in it, basically.
That makes sense. Well, with the importance of origin for both cacao and coffee, do you want to maybe highlight one farm or origin for each that you work with that you find particularly interesting?
Probably our favorite cacao right now. I mentioned those Venezuelans, those are amazing, but we really like one from Uncommon. It's called Chuncho. It's from Peru. It's an heirloom, so it's just really light and soft. It has like strawberry and cream notes to us. That's what we get out of it. So even when we roast it light, it's just more mild and gentle, but still really complex, just super approachable and delicious. So yeah, the Peru Chuncho just kind of stands out for us right now anyway.
Sure.
And then I mentioned earlier the Colombian Pink Bourbon. So that's a single farm one from the Coffee Quest, and it's called Finca Los Jasmines. But those can be underwhelming to people sometimes because they're not too intense. Like it's very subtle and floral, and just I would drink it every day though. You know, if I could if I just had to pick one.
Awesome. Do you find that doing these two things satisfies the same curiosity that you have, or do you find that you kind of work out different things when you're working with each?
I think they're different, yeah. Because for cacao, it's more the whole process, and there's all these little decisions made the whole time, like how long you leave it in the mellinger. So this roasting is important, but even how you sort it affects the flavor, like which defects you pull out and which ones you don't. And it's sort of this whole 3 to 4 day process of little decisions that lead up to the final product, kind of. So even if I like roasted the cacao and gave it to someone else, them putting it in their machine would end up with a different chocolate, like how it gets refined, the surface area and the temperature in the room and all these things. But yeah, coffee just comes down to like this 10 to 12 minute period of the roast, and that's it. Like, and that's that roast. So it's like you're on in that everything you, all those decisions you made during that time, and then it's over, and you hope that you did a good job, basically.
That feels nerve-wracking.
Yeah, a little bit. And it's 20 pounds at a time. That's what I do, or about like 18 pounds. But when you don't, when you're starting, it's scary to like throw that much in and hope, you know. But I think I've heard it described like driving a car, where like it just takes a while to get used to, you know, and after a few years, you don't even think about it anymore. But I do think it still is more stressful and more difficult than chocolate making. Like it's less work, but it's more little things to think about during the roast, and easier to mess up, I guess would be a way to put it. Just if you walk away for 2 minutes, it could be on fire or something, you know.
Let's hope
I
not.
gotta go to the bathroom, but like I can't right now. But like I said, just the transformation and the joy of getting like this raw product and then seeing the end product, that's similar. Just like being really satisfied with the flavors that we were able to pull out of it. And that's the whole thing that we're trying to do. The creative side of chocolate making and coffee is just tweaking those raw products to get them where you think they're best.
Now let's return to our conversation with Kyle. He explains the problems and the opportunities facing cacao and coffee farmers in Colombia, what their biggest needs are, and what makers at the consumer end of these supply chains can do to better support them. What are some of the problems and opportunities that both cacao and coffee farmers share in common?
One of the biggest challenges that both types of producers run into, and I'll speak about Colombia specifically because it is nuanced all over the place, but I really know Colombia better than anything. One of the biggest issues is cash flow. It's, you know, it's the kind of thing where so many producers are willing to sell their products quickly for quick cash, even if the prices are not ideal. They do not have the advantage of like sitting on inventory, waiting for the market to spike or waiting for a better buyer to come along and say they'll pay a little bit more. And so they really just need to sell products quickly, unless they are very well financed by, you know, some sort of company. You know, bank loans are, you know, they do get lines of credit from the bank, and like that's great. Interest is generally low, but it's not usually enough to get by. They still need quicker money. And so that's been one of our biggest goals, is helping producers with that. Yeah, it is without question the trickiest thing. I mean, you can certainly say low prices across the board. I mean, that's kind of an obvious thing for anyone who spent time in Colombia in these industries. It's clear that, you know, paying coffee pickers the equivalent of like $20 a day for what is legitimately the most physically demanding job in the entire supply chain is just like, it's ludicrous.
Yeah.
And that is one of the producers' largest costs. And so it's just the way the industry is set up, it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you look at the commodity market, once you adjust for inflation, prices are going down. They are not increasing. And so it is It's ridiculous to think that producers can survive on less and less, while their costs continue to rise, dramatically. So those are the challenges for both coffee and cacao producers. I mean, there are certainly others. Climate change is a big one. As far as opportunities go, I mean, the industries of specialty coffee and fine cacao are growing. I think there are some reservations, especially in the past, call it 6 months, with inflation really setting in a lot of areas, people becoming a little bit more conscious of what they're spending. I think people are a little scared. That said, the industries, technically speaking, are still growing. And so there are opportunities for all sorts of coffee producers to get their products to market. With cacao, I think one of the greatest opportunities is, simply the fact that most really high-end chocolate makers all have the same cacao. And this has never made sense to me, because the coffee industry is so robust at the moment that, there's a lot of producers who actively want to get away from whatever their competitor is making or serving at that moment. If they see that their most direct competitor has coffee from this producer or this region, they want to go in the opposite direction to distinguish themselves. And like, if you go on some of these, websites that sell all these different chocolate makers products, like it's the same names over and over and over again. Yeah. And that, I think, I get it because there are so few people acting as a facilitator, that there are just very few really high-end products. And so I think that is an opportunity for some lesser known producing areas, lesser known producers. There is a way for them to break into the market if they have someone like us kind of standing in the middle and promoting their products, because very few producers have the ability, the know-how to market their products, let alone the logistics and financing of it all.
Backtracking a little bit to what you said about the cash flow issue, is that largely just a product of the space between harvests? They've only got their crop so often.
That's part of it, for sure. Part of it is also just very low margins, and just not much money coming in. Okay. And so whatever they have got, whether it's coming in on a regular basis or in big lumps, it's just not enough to really thrive on.
Sure.
One of the things I think a lot of people struggle with is really knowing their own cost of production. I've seen a lot of models where people are like, okay, my farm inputs are X amount per kilo, my labor is X amount per kilo, administration X amount per kilo, but very few actually know how to build in their own costs, like the cost of their own labor. Like, I take a salary from my company. Mm-hmm. I don't just live off the earnings from the company. And so there are very few people who are set up to think like that. Not to say they're content to sell their coffee for less than it's worth. They've just not been given the tools to think about it any other way. So yeah, they end up selling for coffee for very little money, or not understanding how to really make a lot more from it and why it's so necessary. And so, yeah, I would say it is certainly a product of seasonality. Coffee, actually, coffee is a little less complicated in that way, at least in Colombia. In other places, it's different. But in Colombia, like, it is a very long, drawn-out harvest season. Cacao is a little bit more concentrated, and so a lot of the producers we work with, they're going to be delivering their harvest between basically June and, I guess, end of May, beginning of August. And then they'll harvest a little bit throughout the year, but they make their money now.
What do you think these two industries can learn from each other, especially at the farm and supply chain levels? Are there things that one is doing that you feel like the other could catch on to?
Yeah, generally, I feel like coffee is pretty far ahead of cacao. And I say that just because there are a number of producers, especially in Colombia and other places as well, where producers are becoming a lot more savvy, are learning the real value of their products, are, using tools like Instagram and Facebook to connect with people and create a market for themselves, rather than relying on a multinational company to tell them what their products are worth. One thing I think certain coffee producers are doing well is that they're learning how to taste coffee, which I think gives them an advantage in the marketplace. It's even harder for cacao producers to have a lab set up like that where they can, taste their own product. But it is this thing where, for the most part in both industries, producers have no idea what their products taste like. And they rely on me and Jose to tell them what their product tastes like and to tell them the value of their coffee. And that creates this power dynamic that I'm not always super comfortable with, but also I don't have an immediate solution for it other than really training people to know the value of their product and to be able to negotiate. And there have been times, quite honestly, where there have been producers who have said, like, I know you've offered me this price, but I think my coffee is worth this price. And I'm like, seriously? I just offered you a whole lot of money. And then I'm like having to check myself because I'm like, no, this is the way it should be. Like they should be trying to push on me and say, like, I want more. Obviously within reason, but it should be a fair negotiation, and it shouldn't be just me telling them what their products are worth.
Related to that, and this is probably the hardest question to address today, with the fact that the products that are being grown in South America, Central America are largely being enjoyed in North America, Europe, how do North American companies go down and help in a way that doesn't become benevolent colonialism, basically? Like, what are those pressure points where, like, you're actually helping and not just let me show you how to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something that I think about pretty frequently, as, at least a white passing person, a white male going to Colombia. It can often feel like, like a savior complex, like, here I am to make your lives better. And I really I don't want to feel that way. Like, I think a part of it is like really being in communities. I think that the advantage that we have is that company is run effectively by my partner Jose, who does live there, has grown up in central Colombia. And we have purchasing points in the areas that we focus on the most. We are literally in the community on an everyday basis. And I think in that way, with producers, it feels like it feels a little less extractive and more, okay, these are people who are with us, struggling side by side with us. As far as how to avoid that type of colonialism, I think really what it would hinge on is empowering producers to take their lives into their own hands and not be reliant on us. And that comes with a level of risk. Like, if you teach producers, whether they're coffee producers or cacao producers, how to evaluate their own products, how to value their products, there is a chance that they might not see you as the benefit you thought you were.
Sure.
And that's happened on occasion to us. But I think that should be the goal, to give them every opportunity to succeed, no matter if it's with us or with somebody else. And it's a tricky thing because we're a small company. We don't have endless resources to invest in people like that. We do our best. We use what little money we have, I think, wisely, in order to support people in more meaningful, more comprehensive ways. But yeah, ultimately, we can't necessarily change the world. We really try to employ a relational type of buying. And this is something that I try to impress on not only our clients, but our clients' clients, the end consumers, people who are drinking the coffee, people who are eating the chocolate. We do everything in our power to convince people to work with us year over year. The same producers, the same names, the same areas. And we really feel like that is crucial for both specialty coffee and fine cacao, for people to support those same names. And to be honest, I think I think chocolate makers do it better than coffee roasters at this point because they want consistent products. They want to see the same name on the package every year. Whereas coffee makers, I think, or coffee roasters are a little more opportunistic. Oh, this year this coffee has gone up 50 cents a pound. Like, I can't afford that. Let's switch to something else. And I really think that ends up hurting producers more than anything, because at a certain point we can't bear all the risk. If we're continuing to buy same coffees, same cacaos, and the prices keep going up and up, like at a certain point, if no one's buying them, then we can't buy them.
Yeah.
And the onus is on us to continue selling them, to continue putting our effort into making people get behind the mission of the company. But what we really try to impress on people is the need for a year-over-year business, the need to support producers year over year, because it's an interesting thing that for us for us later in the supply chain, whether it's in my position as a logistics provider and financier, or if you're a maker, or if you're a consumer, none of these things for us are like life and death situations. Chocolate and coffee, these are luxury products. We do not need them to survive.
Mm-hmm. Yet
for producers, this is a life and death thing. This is how they feed their families. This is like all they have in a lot of cases. And so it's this weird juxtaposition where it's so extremely important for a small producer in Colombia who has a couple hectares of producing land, and so relatively unimportant for a chocolate maker or a coffee producer or a coffee roaster who buys a few kilos a year. Mm-hmm. It's a forgettable thing. Really trying to impress on people at the end of the supply chain the importance of supporting producers all the time, and not just when it's convenient for them.
While both coffee and chocolate have many beautiful things in common related to flavor, creativity, science, and innovation, they unfortunately also both face many of the same challenges. Changes in the economy here in the U.S. can be frustrating for us as consumers, but for farmers in countries of origin, market fluctuations can be discouraging or disastrous. It's a reminder of the ongoing need for change in these industries and for consumer education about why products from responsible makers cost more than the brands they're used to here in the United States and Europe. The experience of enjoying coffee or chocolate can be about escape, but the experiences of sourcing, making, and buying them need to be about recognition and about changing our ways of thinking. Thanks to Kyle and Hans for joining us for today's episode. You can find out more about their companies at the links in the show notes. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.